Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Now, I'm not one much for rumors. That is, unless you're talking about the classic 1977 album by Fleetwood Mac, which is absolutely, I guess, fine. I'm not a huge Fleetwood Mac guy. It's a perfectly fine album. But there was a rumor floating around the retro gaming community for years that buried out somewhere in the New Mexican desert, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of the Atari 2600 video game adaptation of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. A game so infamously terrible that it almost brought down the entire video game industry. Spoiler alert, you may have noticed that didn't exactly happen. It was a rumor that was so huge that it was a full-on urban legend, a myth, a boogeyman that retro gamers would tell to their kids in between frantically blowing into a 38-year-old Mario cartridge so they could show them what Mario was really like, despite the fact the whole reason they even dug their old NES out of their parents' garage was because they saw their kids playing the exact same game on their Switch. But much like the presence of chlorophyll in its stems and leaves, I digress. That's a little science joke for you. Nonetheless, in 2014, the tale would forever lose its status as an urban legend. Not because it was roundly disproved, but quite the opposite. On April 26, 2014, after months of work, a film crew of all things managed to excavate the landfill site in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where the supposed 700,000 games were buried. This was for a documentary, by the way, called Atari Game Over, which, if you have about an hour, is well worth the watch, especially if you're into video game history, but even if you're not. But the truth can be deceiving. It was completely true that they were able to excavate about 1,300 of those 700,000 games, but only about 10% of what was covered were actually ET games. In fact, I will make the argument that if you are under the impression that ET is one of the worst games ever made, then you just clearly never played or don't remember enough of the games from that era. Yes, there was no shortage of classics like Space Invaders, Centipede, Pitfall, Frogger, or Asteroids. But along with these were legions of completely uninspired messes, boring and pointless to no end. And let's not forget, by the end, games that just plain didn't work. Now, is E.T. one of the best games for the 2600? Clearly not. However, I will argue that the game's designer, Howard Scott Warsaw, was actually one of the best game designers for the system, whose credits include much-loved Raiders of the Lost Ark and probably my favorite game for the system, Yar's Revenge. All I'm saying is we should probably start putting some respect on his name. The real truth of the matter is not that Atari was so ashamed of the game that they buried it forever in the desert. Rather, that the entire video game industry was going through a crash at that moment. And Atari, who had been at the forefront of the video game revolution, got hit the hardest. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. There was a manufacturing plant that Atari had in Texas. It was bursting at the seams because business had been good, and then came the crash, and almost overnight, the industry had become a shit show. Not only were they not moving all of the cartridges they had created, but returns for the inventory that they did sell was bombarding the warehouse. So, smartly, unable and unwilling to buy more storage for these games and components that were never going to sell, They cut their losses and took all that extra stock to the closest landfill that would let them dump it there, and hoped to quietly bury it all under a layer of cement and move on with their lives in a video game manufacturing plant that finally had room for them to try and make the most of the last days of the Atari. And they would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for those meddling documentary filmmakers. This infamous era in video game history is known as the video game crash of 1983. Unless you lived in Japan, then it was called the Atari shock, which is just infinitely cooler. And there were many reasons for the crash. Way too many to go over in any depth here, but among them was a market that got flooded with different systems. Atari wasn't able to hold on to its publishing rights, which led to an influx in games from third-party publishers. A lot of them not great. Some of them completely broken. And, well, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, a brave few of them were even X-rated. Which brings me to this episode's trigger warnings. But first, your weekly friendly reminder to go check out our Patreon over at patreon.com/bandmediapodcast. Despite my liberal use of words like we and our, this wonderful program is pretty much a one human show from bottom to top. Anything you are willing to give, I am willing to take with the utmost gratitude. Plus, we are constantly working to add new rewards, so come check it out at patreon.com/bandmediapodcast. And without further ado, here are the trigger warnings. We will be talking about rape, albeit 4-bit artistic depictions of it, but it will still be discussed, and the abuse and mass slaughter of the indigenous peoples of what is now known as the United States of America. So let's take it back to about a year before the crash, 1982. The market had already gone into its full Wild West mode, but the nefarious crash still lay in wait just beyond the horizon, out of sight not only of the consumer, but even the so-called industry insiders. A duo formed in the most unlikely of places, that being Stuart Keston and Joel Martin. They were working together on a new project that was, quote, TV game cartridge containers, end quote, called the Classic Case. So basically a very fancy and classic case for most likely Atari 2600 cartridges or carts if you are a very important individual who has not the time to waste on extraneous syllables such as myself, as I think that last sentence demonstrates. Now, nobody at this point really had a long, storied career in video games, especially home consoles. Pong, while not the first video game, but certainly the watershed one, had been released only a decade earlier in its original cabinet setup. Or cab, again, if you're a very important person like I am. That being said, even for that era, Keston and Martin had very little experience in the video game market. In fact, trying to develop the Classic Case was both of their first forays into the wide world of video games. Before that, Martin had worked in the toy industry, and Keston was a freelance marketing consultant who had worked with the likes of L'Oreal and the now defunct Sterling Drug. Nonetheless, the two were struck by an idea, and that idea was to make X-rated video games. Together, the two of them formed the not-so-sexily titled American Multiple Industries, or AMI. Now, AMI needed a title for its run of adults-only video game erotica. They settled for the much sexier Mystique. And even then, they still needed something that would make their brand more recognizable. This is where Caballero Control Corporation, or CCC, comes in. Now, known as Caballero Home Video, Caballero was and is no stranger to the adult industry. Longtime listeners of the podcast, and by that I mean people who literally listened to the last month's episode, will remember the story of Tracy Lords, the underage adult film star whose entire catalog, sans one film, became illegal overnight when it discovered that she had been underage, with the exception of that one film, Tracy, I Love You. Well, it was Caballero that bought up the rights for that movie for 10 years until it reverted back to Tracy Lords herself, who has shelved it permanently. Caballero was also known for its long run of a series called Swedish Erotica. Don't let the name fool you, though. Despite being called Swedish Erotica and being produced by Caballero, a Spanish word for gentleman, these were homegrown here in the good old US of A. In fact, the Swedish Erotica series started out as a series of loops. For those who don't know what a loop was, it was a short pornographic scene, usually shot on 8 or 16 millimeter film, that would be used in things like peep show booths, sold to folks who actually owned projectors, or rented out to things like bachelor parties. Fun fact, B-movie legend Ed Wood is known to have made loops for the Swedish Erotica brand. Though the exact number is unknown, it is generally agreed upon that it was at least 19. It was Keston who spoke to Caballero early on about his line of adult video games. Caballero liked the idea, and Keston was able to talk them into licensing their Swedish Erotica brand to AMI for their first 3 games. Fun fact, many years later, Caballero would go on to release a small series of pornographic DVDs called Ben and Cherries, each one spoofing a different ice cream flavor with box art reminiscent of the well-loved Ben & Jerry's brand. Titles included Boston Cream Thigh, New York Super Fat and Chunky, and Harry Garcia. People upset about the existence of these spoofs included Ben and Jerry, who promptly sued, and in a court-approved settlement, Caballero agreed to stop making and selling the Ben & Jerry's series. So now AMI had its full branding for its series. Mystique presents Swedish Erotica, and then whatever the title of that particular game was. It was a mouthful, to be sure, but not as much of a mouthful as the first game we're going to talk about, Beat 'em and Eat 'em, a game where a man is frantically masturbating on the top of a building, ejaculating down large globs of cum. You control 2 naked women on the street as they move back and forth trying to catch said blobs of cum before they hit the ground. In case this sounds the slightest bit familiar to you, this game is just a dirty ripoff of the legit classic Kaboom for the Atari 2600. And if that is not why it sounds familiar, then I highly recommend you go talk to someone. The game did have some fun little bonus features, though, like getting a bonus life for scoring 69 points, and the 2 nude women licking their lips after having successfully completed a round. The next entry on our veritable smorgasbord of Mystique Presents Swedish Erotica was Bachelor Party. Bachelor Party takes its cue from the Beat 'em and Eat 'em by being a dirty ripoff of an already existing game. This time around, it is based off the game Breakout, another Atari classic. You know, the one where you slide the paddle across the bottom of the screen like a sideways pong and bounce the ball to the top of the screen to break the blocks. Well, in this version, the blocks are naked women, and the ball is a naked man, and the paddle is a jar of the Bill Cosby endorsed Spanish Fly, an elixir that acts as an aphrodisiac so powerful that no woman can deny you, and it will even give you a raging erection. Now, firstly, none of that actually happens. That is complete and dangerous medical misinformation. Second of all, if it were true, raging erections aside, I hope it goes without saying that using a substance to make anyone act against their will for the express purpose of taking advantage of them sexually is rape. And I feel this is a sticking point here. Rape is bad. The purpose of this game is to bounce your naked man into as many naked women as you can. Each time you do, it represents you having sex with the woman, and she will be removed from the playfield, advancing your score. There is one mechanic in the game that is of note. The nude man is animated with a penis. Keep in mind, we're talking about animation so basic it makes Duck Hunt look like a Pixar film, but it was able to spare about 3 or 4 pixels to give the character an exaggerated penis. This penis would point upwards after having hit the Spanish fly paddle, making him erect. After bouncing into a woman, the man's penis would point down, having lost his erection after having sex with the woman. Though, oddly enough, this seems to be purely an aesthetic decision, not having any effect on the actual gameplay. Now look, 2 dirty games on an ancient 8-bit system is surely fun and all, but it was the 3rd game that not only gives this episode its name, but the game that absolutely cemented the series into the annals of controversial video game history. The game was the absolutely infamous Mystique Presents Swedish erotica Custer's Revenge. Now, the story in classic video games is never really as clear-cut as we wish it would be. But I lay before you now the description of the game that I think is the most reasonable summation of the game. In the game, you play as real-life historical figure Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer during the infamous Battle of Little Bighorn, aka Custer's Last Stand. So called because it was the battle in which Custer lost his life. But it is now your job to rewrite history and save Custer from certain death by walking naked across a field of falling arrows and cock-level cactuses so that you can rape an indigenous woman who is tied to a post. Well, say what you will for AMI, but for their first title that was a completely original game, they went hard. No pun intended. Now, here comes what some folks would call a more traditional history lesson, so I will keep it quick. George Armstrong Custer started his military career in the Civil War, and to his credit, spoiler alert, a phrase you will not be hearing me say about him again, he was on the right side of that war, fighting for the side that would end slavery. You can even spot him with good old honest Abe Lincoln in some old photos. And he was also present at Robert E. Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant in Virginia. Then, after the Civil War, he set his sights on the American Indian Wars. The American Indian Wars is the name given to the seemingly countless number of battles that European governments and colonists of North America, and later the American government itself, keep in mind, these wars actually predate the United States founding, against the many tribes that made up the indigenous people of what we now call the Americas. Wars so brutal and long-lasting, not only would they last from 1609 to 1924, but also result in the mass murder and depopulation of the indigenous peoples, but also the loss of their homeland. By the way, to put that timeline into perspective, the wars not only started before America was officially a country, but it didn't end until 21 years after the invention of the airplane. That is 315 years. As I record this, America itself is only 247 years old. Custer would find himself joining the fight, this time on the very wrong side. On July 28, 1866, his first big splash was at the Battle of the Wichita River, where he opened fire on a Southern Cheyenne encampment and, in the process, focused on taking prisoners that were women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. This was in an attempt to break the spirit of the warriors he was fighting. This isn't a wacky conspiracy theory, by the way. He specifically wrote about it in his autobiography, My Life on the Plains. As Lindsay Stallone's Marshall, assistant professor at Illinois State University, put it when talking about the Battle of the Wichita River, quote, which should be more properly termed a massacre, end quote. Now, this leads us to the infamous Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn. There is a classical understanding of the American West that is framed by our schools, our churches, our institutional learning facilities. And when it comes to Custer's Last Stand, it goes something like this. Custer, a Civil War hero, was with his troops in what we now call Montana. Then, out of nowhere, he was assaulted by a cowardly sneak attack by an enormous army of native peoples led by the infamous Sitting Bull. Custer and his men put up a valiant battle, but in the end, they were just too outnumbered and were wiped out by Sitting Bull, despite the fact they fought tooth and nail until the very end, trying to defend the innocent settlers. The truth, though, can be deceiving. In fact, the settlers were far from innocent. They were on the land of the Lakota Nation. Not in the sense that the Lakota people had been the original inhabitants before the settlers had even shown up, which, by the way, is completely valid on its own, but by ratification of the Treaty of Fort Laramie between several indigenous tribes and the United States government. They were the explicit owners of that land by any definition. So why then did the settlers try to settle the land whose ownership had already been legally settled? Well, it was because there was gold in them there hills, and they wanted it. So I guess fuck their word and legal obligation. Enter the military, who decided rather than protect the treaty law of the government they represent, that it would probably be better to attack the legal owners of the land who were having their land stolen for a second time. Also, there was no surprise attack. Custer sent out scouts. He knew there was an encampment of men, women, and children, and elderly and disabled. 4 out of 5, which were his favorite form of human shield. Again, not hyperbole, but something he actually did. He was getting all kinds of ready to pull the same shit he did back at Wichita River. To once again quote Lindsay Stellonis Marshall, quote, "We should think of this as a successful defense by Native people against an attempted act of genocide," end quote. There's only so many times one can fuck around before they find out, and George Armstrong Custer had been on the wrong side of history since the Civil War ended. Also, you know those heroic pictures of him in the history books? Well, it turns out not only did he piss his pants before he died, his last words were, quote, "I'm sorry, Daddy, uwu," end quote. Which, if I'm being completely honest, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, that last part's probably not true. But I can't prove that it's not. Point being, you'll have to forgive me for not shedding any tears for a man whose plan A was to use small children as armor. But back to the present, or 1982 as it were. All 3 games ready to be packaged in specialty clamshell-like faux leather covered cases that may or may not have been the so-called classic case that brought Kenston and Martin together in the first place, and shipped. So AMI sent out announcements to distributors far and wide, eventually catching the eye of none other than the Hollywood Reporter, who decided to write up an article titled "Adult Video Games Will Titillate Home Market Beginning in October," where they interviewed none other than AMI President Stuart Keston and Caballero Vice President Al Bloom. It was there they laid out their inspirations, like 4 more adult titles by January, to make video game versions of some of Caballero's adult films, and that the price of their game would be about $50, which is $159 in today's money, up from the normal release price of about $30 for most Atari games. And that, all in all, business was doing good. They also talked future plans of using adult games to break into the market, but then creating more child-friendly games. Now, this may sound like a crazy idea, but Caballero had pulled it off before. That's right. In 1981, Noel Bloom president of Caballero, and amazingly no relationship to Vice President Al Bloom, had started to buy up the rights to children's shows and cartoons and release it under the brand of Family Home Entertainment. Now, if you are of a certain age, that name may sound unsettlingly familiar. Maybe you remember it better by the initials that scrolled out in different colors of crayons on yellow lettering paper. FHE. And remember seeing this adorable logo before some of your favorite shows that you happen to have a VHS copy of. Shows like The Transformers, G.I. Joe, Gem and the Holograms, Thundercats, Inspector Gadget, Defenders of the Earth, Pound Puppies, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Gumby, Clifford the Big Red Dog, The Care Bears, and Bucky O'Hare. And the list goes on. Now, did I need to list all of those? No. But if I have to know it, then you have to know it too. Our childhoods were brought to us by pornography. As the release day was coming closer and news of Custer's revenge was starting to get some blowback from the population at large, AMI made a drastic shift in its advertising tactics and started to downplay the pornographic element of their game and, more importantly, the whole rape thing. By September of '82, when Keston gave an interview to the LA Times, he never brought up Caballero. And when asked about the Swedish erotica title, he said that it was just a tactic to gain credibility with video store retailers. He went on further to say that the games were more akin to dirty jokes than pornography. Quote, "Our object is not to arouse. Our object is to entertain. When people play our games, we want them smiling. We want them laughing." End quote. But perhaps the biggest backpedal was to interviewers after hundreds of protesters showed up to, do what protesters do and protest the game. It was October 14th of 1982, and the New York Hilton was hosting the National Music, Sound, and Video Show, where AMI was scheduled to reveal their games to the trade press. They had had a sneak peek of sorts the night before at a Manhattan nightclub to the non-trade press, of which some of the footage of the game made it onto the local news. The result was that aforementioned hundreds of protesters from the local chapters of groups like the American Indian Community House of NYC, aka AICH, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, and Women Against Pornography. That's a WAP. It was during this protest that Keston would tell the feminist newspaper Heresies, quote, "There's no rape and ravage scene. He does make an impression on the Indian girl, but you can see she's having a good time. A smile comes across her face." End quote. And Joel Martin told the Associated Press, quote, "He's seducing her, but she's a willing participant," end quote. Just like most women, immovably bound to a stake. Here's the problem, though. Even if you were, for some reason, compelled to take the gigantic leap of faith that the woman tied to the stake, likes it, you still have an even more colossal hurdle in front of you. That being, the game is actually entitled Custer's Revenge. Custer, the guy who died after wetting his pants and yelling out a high-pitched uwu, taking his revenge on the cartoonishly large-chested indigenous woman. What else could that title mean? Well, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, if you thought things had gotten childish and stupid before now, you best prep that rocket for Jupiter, because things are about to get a whole lot stupider. You see, Custer isn't taking out his revenge on indigenous folks by raping one of them. The indigenous woman's name is Revenge, and poor Revenge has been strapped to a pole by God only knows who, really. And the only thing that can make her feel better is a heaping serving of Custer's custard. That's right. Our maiden Revenge is nothing more than a damsel in distress, and Custer, her knight in shining, cowboy boots, hat, bandana, and nothing else. As the box for the game itself reads, quote, "You are General Custer. Your dander is up. Your pistol is waving. You've set your sights on a ravishing maiden named Revenge. But she's not about to take it lying down, by George. Help is on the way. If you're to get to Revenge, you'll have to rise to the challenge, dodge a tribe of flying arrows, and protect your flanks against some downright mean, prickly cactus. Remember, if you can stand pat and last past the stings and arrows, you can stand last. Remember, revenge is sweet. Every time old Custer scores, he comes up smiling and right back for more. The higher the score, the more challenging the action gets." End quote. Which, I mean, seems plausible if you were looking to defend the game in any way. Or at least it would be had they not sent out a press release before the game dropped that had the following listed as the box text. Quote, "You are General Custer. Your dander is up. Your pistol waving. You've hog-tied a ravishing Indian maiden and have the chance to rewrite history to even up an old score. Now the Indian maiden's hands may be tied, but she's not about to take it lying down, by George. Help is on the way. If you're to get revenge, you'll have to rise up to the challenge, dodge a tribe of flying arrows, and protect your flanks against some downright mean prickly cactus. But if you can stand pat and last past the stings and arrows, you can stand last. Remember, every time old Custer makes a score, the more challenging the action gets." End quote. Which is what folks in the industry refer to as a big old-fashioned oopsie-doodle. Also, I don't believe, grammatically speaking, that a group of arrows is called a tribe of arrows. Speaking of folks in the industry, after news broke of the protest, Atari became none too pleased with AMI. Now, keep in mind, AMI was a complete third party with no actual connection to Atari. They were just making a game that could be played on their system. Nonetheless, it was Atari who was receiving a whopping 1,200 complaints a day. The game, along with its less rapey and racist brethren, began to hit shelves in the last week of November of 1982, and it did so amongst an absolute shitstorm of controversy. There were numerous lawsuits and different litigations with different jurisdictions trying to ban the game. The AMI offices were even vandalized. What's worse, the reviews were coming in, and they were pretty much in agreement that the games, well, that they weren't good. And to be certain, these aren't the greatest games. In fact, they are bad games, but certainly not the worst the system had to offer. That, combined with the fact AMI representatives lost their fucking minds somewhere along the way, telling the press things like, quote, "The only thing that might be construed as violent is tying an Indian maiden to a post and ravishing her, but he doesn't beat her first," end quote. By January of 1983, AMI could take the negative press no more and sold the games off to a new company called Play Around, who discontinued Custer's Revenge and then started to sell 2-in-1 carts of the other two games, which for the Atari meant that you had these super long cartridges that had openings at the top and the bottom, and you could just flip them around to play the other game. They also created gender-swapped versions of Beat 'em and Eat 'em and Bachelor Party, one can only assume as a sort of olive branch for the blatant sexism of Custer's Revenge. Now, to be sure, there's a whole other story involving Play Around and their possible links back to AMI, but that is way outside the scope of this episode. I will highly recommend that you read the Kotaku.com article, Porno Hustlers of the Atari Age by Kate Willaert, who does both phenomenal and groundbreaking research into this whole subject, and I can't recommend it enough. The link will be in the show notes. But at the end of the day, if the real death throes for Custer's Revenge was its cancellation on Playground, then the following press release was its eulogy. Quote, "We will be discontinuing Custer's Revenge in our adult video game line because we believe that even though America Multiple's intent was to depict an entertaining, amusing scenario, the game came to symbolize rape and racism in the eyes of too many people. We are 100% in favor of good sexual fun between consenting video images, but no company would want to be associated with either racism or violence towards women. Such themes have no place within the context of a video game." End quote. You know, I forgot to mention in all of this that among the many people who took issue with this game were the descendants of General George Armstrong Custer himself. Now, I haven't come to the biggest defense of this game, but I will say this. Some of the historical liberties that the game takes in regard to Custer himself are understandable given the limits of the Atari 2600 and the general setup of the game. For example, when Custer dies in the game, he has no pants that he can piss in, and the audio software was nowhere close to being able to replicate speech like, quote, "I saw we daddy, ooh woo," end quote, at the time. Final fun fact. I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. We got a Patreon now, so if you want to directly support the show, please go check it out over at patreon.com/bandmediapodcast. Also, feel free to find us on all the socials, but TikTok is where I'm most active, at BandRonnie. Please like, comment, and share, but if you really want to help the podcast out, tell your friends about us. That way, we can all be friends. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.